Hey there and welcome back. So now that we've completed modeling all of our fruits and we've finished modeling our package and doing our package rendering shot, now we're on to the final task of this tutorial, and that's creating the magazine advertisement. So this scene is going to be based around the last scene that we created with the package. We're just going to be doing some modifications to it and pulling the fruit into this scene. So let's open up that scene really quick and get to work on that. So you can open up your package file that you've created, or I'm going to open up my package 4 here in the video 14 folder of the content. So the first thing we're going to do here is, for this purpose, we don't need this background any longer. So I am going to take that and delete it. And just temporarily, I'm going to disable these lights. Now, if you remember from the original illustration that we had for the magazine ad, that the lid was open and the little fruit bites were bursting out of the package. So we want to open up this lid, and if you'll recall, when we made that cap, we assigned a weight map to just the lid section here. So I am going to go ahead and add a deformer onto that weight map now so that we can animate that element very easily. So what we want to do is go into our items mode here by pressing 5, selecting our cap element, and then in our lists here we're going to select our cap flip weight map. Now we're going to need to be in our setup workspace, so I'm going to hit the Control Tab switcher to jump over into my setup tab here, and you see over here we can actually see that weight map when it's selected in our viewport. So what we're going to want to do is come down here to our Deformer subtab of the toolbox, and I'm just going to click Transform, and that's automatically going to apply. If I open up my packaging here to the cap, you can see it's added a Transform Deformer in here, and it's automatically assigned that weight map here as the cat flip just by selecting that without us having to connect anything together or specify that manually. So the problem that we have, and I cannot explain this, is our locator handle for our transform effector is all the way up here. So we want to position this into another place that makes sense for the animation that we want to do. So right now, if we were to try to move this, actually, you can see it's moving that cap, but that's not going to allow us to ever rotate that. So we want to position that relative to that cap opening so that we can rotate it very easily and flip that open. So let's drop this. So what we need to do is we need to move this, but we need to move into the setup action state. And what this does is this defines Modo that this is the resting position when everything starts. So any edits that we make while we're in this mode won't affect our object. So by making sure everything's selected, or excuse me, deselected, then I'm going to select that object. And then I'm just going to move that pretty close to where I want it, and then Shift A will zoom me in. So now I want to do a little bit more accurate positioning on this. So I'm going to select that cap and go press 3 to go into my polygons mode. And then I'm going to select these 4 polygons right here on the top of my cap. And what I want to do is I want to align my work plane to that selection. Now what this is going to allow us to do is we can then go back into our items mode, select that locator, and here under the setup, there's commands that allow you to move things to the center origin of your work plane. So I'm just going to click on the set to work plane position, and that's going to move that locator to that work plane position. So now I can deselect everything by hitting escape. I can reset my work plane, and then I can also exit out of setup mode. So now whenever we take this locator and we rotate that, you can see now we're able to flip open that lid. So get that nice and wide open so we can get our spray of candy coming out of there. I think that looks pretty good. So we can actually move this transform effector into our little group here just to keep things nice and neat. Okay, so I think our next task is we're going to want to set up our background and set up our frame. So we already know from the client specifications that this is going to be a standard magazine size. So for us, that's going to be a resolution in the render output. So we want to set this to make sure we get the aspect ratio correct. It's going to be a 2500 wide by 3250. So 2500 by 3250 will get you 8 3/8 by 10 7/8, which is the standard US magazine size. Your European magazines or other places of the world, that might be different, but for us in the US, that's what the setting is. So now if we jump into a camera view, we can see that that's the aspect ratio that our camera is now being set up as. So I think my next step that I want to do is I'm going to place the comp that we received from the client into the background so that we can use that to work off to position all of our elements. So I think if we jump into our environment here, I'm going to go into this environment and I'm going to add that image into here. So I'm going to load image and we're going to jump into our content backdrops and I'm going to take this sketchy backdrop concept image and I'm going to place that in there. And in order to be able to see this, what we want to do is we want to project that from the camera's point of view, and that's done in the texture locator. So we're going to take that guy and we're just set that as a front projection, and then we want to set that as the standard camera as our projection axis. So now whenever we select the environment, we can see that in the background. So what we're going to want to do is position our camera, try and match that drawing as closely as we can. So it's just I'm using the Alt and the Shift, just the standard transform. Tools here, so it's just the zoom, the rotate, and the pan around in the view, just the typical shortcuts. And I'm just kind of tweaking this until I get this just about right. So I think that is pretty good. So if we toggle off that background image really quick and we open up our preview window here, scale that down so you can see it more easily. Alright, so that's what our image looks like. Looks like we still have the depth of field enabled. So let's select that camera inside of there. And on mine, I'm going to disable the depth of field. And remember, we had turned off those lights. So that's why it's looking a little bit darker here. So, and another one of the key aspects of the image that was supplied to us by the client is they had a green, sort of rich background that gradiated off to the sides. So now I'm going to add that in to my environment. So that is going to be done by Add Layer, Processing, and Gradient. All right, let's drag this into the proper location. So we're going to set this up so that it's the environment color. And since this is in this top environment, it's only visible to the camera. It's not affecting the colors of anything else. So remember, we're still reusing that older scene. So we want to go in here and set the color. So we're going to set that to some nice green color. Something that still allows this to sort of pop out of it. And then now, at the edges of the screen, we want it to change to a darker green. And the way we're going to get that to change at the edges is we want to modulate this gradient over the length of the sample parameters to the screen. So you have X, Y, and then R, which is sort of like the center outward. So you see now that we're getting the center outward of the screen. That sort of almost acts as like a glow to sort of highlight the product a little bit more. So we can open up our editor here to get a little bit more control over that. So I'm going to pull that outside just so we get a little bit of darkening at the edges. So I think that gives me exactly what I want. So I'm going to temporarily close preview here for a second and jump into my perspective view. We can disable those lights again if you find that they are getting in the way. Now what I want to do is we want to save this scene. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to go to Save As, and I'm going to go into Content, Video 15, because that's what this is. I'm going to call this Advert Layout 01. So I'm going to click on there, and I'm going to overwrite my little test scene that I've already created. So you'll be opening up this exact scene that I'm working on right here. So our next step is to start pulling in the fruit. So if we jump back to the camera here and temporarily, so we have all of these fruit sort of almost floating in zero gravity as they've been sort of thrown up, and this is sort of the zenith of before they start falling back down. So this is how we get this sort of weightless sort of feeling to our object. So we want to start placing the fruit elements that we've created into these positions inside of the image. So let us open up all of our fruits. So I think we can open those in, if I can locate it, video 10, all fruits. So yeah, these were all of our various fruits that we had. So I'm going to select those 4 elements. Make sure nothing else is selected. And then I'm going to drag these up to the top here in our advertising layout. Pull those into our scene. All right, and now what we want to do is we want to make sure that our shader tree is still clean. So I don't think we need this all fruits layer from the other scene, so I can just delete that. So we have the orange, lemon, strawberry, and cherry. So I'm just going to call these all fruits. And we can just move this up to the top underneath the base shader. Just kind of move these around. So I don't really want to scale these elements. I really want to kind of create a sense of depth inside of here. So I'm going to keep these all at their existing scales. So what I want to do now is select this environment image, and I'm going to start positioning around these fruits. So we can just grab the handles, and making sure that you don't have select through. I find for me that this helps. You might prefer having the select through on. We can select local here, but we just want to rotate these elements and start putting them in position, sort of matching up this backdrop that we have. So see, I'm not scaling them down, I'm actually move them backwards in 3D space to get them to the location that I want. So I think that's pretty good for the strawberry. I'm just using the standard transform tools, the move and rotate. Maybe get the lemon inside of here. Rotate him around and bring him upwards. So the cool thing about having the handles, using handles, that even if this goes behind this object, I can still grab that handle and move him into place here. don't think we're going to get the fruits to all match up 100%. So once we've got the initial fruit set up in here and positioned, I think that's not up high enough. So we're basically probably easy enough to jump back and forth between sort of local and world in order to grab those handles to get these to move kind of how you expect. So I think that's pretty good for the cherries. All right, so now that we have the initial fruits in place, one of each one of these guys, we can start making duplicates of it, but we don't want to add a bunch of geometry to our scene. So what we can do is we can right mouse click on these and create an instance. So this is basically just going to be a reference object that points back to the original object. So we can move that into place that way. And the way to do this with the keyboard is just select your object and then hit Shift D, and then you can move that into position. Let's move this up here, and then we want to move this lemon down. Rotate him around. All right, so you don't want to see me duplicating and cloning and positioning all of these fruits around in this scene. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and continue working on my scene, and I'll be back in a few seconds after I have this scene all set up. So I'm going to save here really quick. Okay, so I have all of my little fruits here positioned. We can sort of get a sense of how many objects were positioned here so they could all be visible to the camera. I'll jump back to our camera view really quick, and then I'm going to enable my gradient and turn off my concept backdrop. And then I'm going to quickly open preview here just so we can get a look at our fruit to make sure everything made it over properly. So it looks like everything's actually looking pretty good right here. We got our fruits in there. Getting a decent amount of depth inside of this scene. And our package still looks nice and bright and happy. Okay, so the next task that we're going to do on this is we need to do a little spray of these candy bites, the fruit bites, coming out of the package so that it's going to look like it's bursting with all of these delicious flavors. So we're going to use some particles. We're going to do a quick little particle spray coming out of that, and then we're going to use a replicator to assign those different fruit bites to those particles, and then add a little bit of collision on them. And then we'll be completing up our lighting and finishing off this scene. So let's jump into doing the particles. So in order to complete this image, we need to do two things. We want to have this open spout spraying out a spray of the little fruit bites candies. And then these images, or this negative space back here, we want to fill this with more little pieces of fruit going off in the distance. So this just gets a little bit more busy back here. So it just looks like there's a lot of fruit inside of there. Is really one of the ideas we want to get across. So let's jump in right away. What we're going to do to do this thing is we're going to use a quick little particle simulation. So it's very much like using dynamics, uses a lot of the same controls. And then we do that also within the setup tab where we already are under the particles here. So let me jump into perspective view of my scene. And I'm going to temporarily turn off all those fruits. I just put those all within a single grouped folder there so I could turn those off. Same thing with the lights, just so I don't have the distraction of those in the scene. All right. So here we are. So in order to create particles with which to assign our objects to, we need to do a little simulation here. And in order to create a simulation, we're going to need some sort of an emitter. So the emitter basically just generates the particles within our scene. So I'm just going to use the basic radial emitter. Is going to be perfect for our needs. So you just click on that button, and that adds a radial emitter and a particle simulation object into your scene. And then it's just going to be dependent on where we position that. So I want that to be spraying the particles out of the little spout here. And I also want to limit the angle that they're going to be spraying. So with the item selected, we can go in the properties form here, and we can change the cone angle to something much smaller, say like 25 degrees. Maybe that's too big, 20 degrees. So now it's going to act sort of like a trumpet horn, just spraying those particles directly out. So we're using the same controls that we use with the dynamics. We can just use this simulation button here, the run simulation, and that'll start spraying out our particles. So maybe that angle is a little bit too wide still. We don't have to worry about the particles colliding with any of these other elements because we don't have any dynamics turned on. So what's happening right now is these particles would just fly through these other elements in here just because it's like they don't even exist. So there's ways of making them collide, but for this simple illustration, I don't think we need to go through with doing that. So let me go here to the camera view and see if that's kind of making that in the angle that we want. Maybe we want to angle this up a little bit more and move that over. All right. So same as before, in order to make this part of the scene so that we can actually see what's going on, we need to sim this. So we can just click the little simulate button, and I'm just going to accept the defaults for that. And then when you drag out the timeline, now you'll see that the particles are playing back in your scene. So what we can do is we are going to add in a replicator now. And we want to assign our prototype as the fruit bit. So that initial fruit bit is going to be our prototype. And then our point source is going to be the very bottom of the list. We're going to go to that particle simulation element there. So you see that they're just going to be sort of flying up like little UFOs. So we can go into the replicator with that selected. And then we want to go in here to the variations, and we're going to go to the random twist, click on the gang edit, and we're just going to go 360 on all of those channels. So it'll just randomly rotate those elements around. So we're getting a little bit of intersection here. So I'd moved that emitter over. Let me move that back. Just have that centered on the Z. So let's run that simulation again and see what results we get. You can see just for doing particles like this where it's very simple, it's almost instantaneous. So we can jump back to our camera. See, I think we're select that in order to see the actual particles. If we turn on our fruits, we can kind of see maybe that's just a little bit too dense. We want to have a lot of candy coming out, but maybe not quite that much. So I think I'm going to go into the simulation, into the emitter, and I'm going to turn down the emission rate maybe to about 24 and sim that again. So we're probably getting a lot of elements in here that are overlapping. The way to be able to see your replicators, I should note that if you have the little gear, invisibility, let's see, where is it? Drawing and control, replicators, it'll show those either none, selected, or all, and I have it set to selected. So that way, whenever I select the replicator, it'll show me what they look like. But yeah, we're getting a ton of overlapping right here, which really doesn't look very good. So let's add some dynamics to that so that we can get those so they can know how to not collide with each other. This isn't going to be perfect, but it's going to help a lot. So the way you do that is by selecting the replicator and then going into dynamics. And then we want to make that an active rigid body. And what that does is it adds a dynamic replicator in there. It just basically allows replicator elements to collide with each other. So I'm going to do another simulation on that so that it can calculate that. And you'll see now all of our particles are going down. And why is that happening? Well, when we introduce the dynamics into it, the dynamic solver itself defaults to having gravity enabled. So that way if you have objects like bricks or something that are getting hit and they're going to fall down, well, you want that gravity force to do that. But I'm going to select the solver and I'm going to disable gravity for our purposes. Turn that back on, do a quick sim. So you see, now the problem that we're having is they're spawning from a little tiny space inside of there, and they're causing collisions that's already causing them to be acted upon by forces of the other particles. So what we can do is we can delay when the time until collision. So if we do that to say like 1, I believe that is measured in frames. And also what we can do is we can go into this emitter. And if we go down here, we can do the start radius. We can actually, you can see it here a little bit if I turn off the replicator. See this little circle right here? This basically creates a volume or an area that particles will be emitted from. So that way they'll be further apart from each other, so you won't have to deal with those collisions from starting at such a tiny little point. So let us once again do that simulation. Turn back on our replicator. So we're getting some strays there, but we could solve that by creating a collision object that would sort of funnel these all in a certain direction. But we don't have enough elements here that I think it's going to make it worthwhile to do that. So let us look at our simulation. Try and find a set of frames that we think looks pretty good. It's like magic. I like that. Just looking for a frame that I think is going to sort of not have too many particles on it. Maybe we still have too many emitting. Do this to 15. Do another simulation. Like I said, I don't think you're ever gonna be able to get it perfect since this is all sort of random, but I think right there maybe has a good amount of little candies spraying out, and we can adjust some of these around to fill in some of these holes. So the way we can do that is we can basically take this replicator now and we can freeze this in its current state. So whatever this particle simulation is doing. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So you do that under Item, and then down here under Replicators, and I'm just going to freeze Replicator. And what that does is it just converts your replicated items into a bunch of instances. So that way, making sure we have nothing else selected. I'm also going to delete the dynamic replicator and the solver now because they are no longer necessary. And I'm going to save this scene. And just for good measure, I'm going to call this the layout 2. I like to save variations sometimes on files so I can go back multiple steps without having to remove stuff. Alright, so problem at hand. Let's get rid of some of these stray elements here. Definitely that one. That one is intersecting, but I think we can leave that. Drop my selection. Definitely don't want that. And all of these ones are outside of the frame, so we can get rid of those. So hit delete, and those will go away. So now this allows us to sort of go in here and zoom in and look at any of these that are intersecting and start moving around. So you want to be cognizant to make sure that those look like they're spraying out the little hole, since we didn't create any actual collision stuff. This one's definitely colliding in here. Keep jumping back and looking. Maybe this one can get moved down a little bit. This is where I kind of find the screen action center helpful too. So it ends up moving these parallel to the screen, which makes it a little easier to move in my opinion. Maybe this one's a little too far over to the side. So the simulation that you're going to do is going to be very different from the one that I did. So you're going to probably be moving these in even different positions from where I'm moving these. So if we open up a quick preview here, we'll see since we used that same piece that we filled the container with, it's going to already inherit those variations that we built into the object. So I think that right there looks pretty good. Didn't take us too long to do that. Don't think I see any other obvious intersections. So I'm going to leave those as is and save our file. Alright, so now the next and last thing that we want to do here is we want to fill up this back area with some more particles, or with more fruit, excuse me. So I'm going to create a new item with which to make another replicator element, and I'm going to call this, or this is going to be a particle cloud. So I'm going to turn those fruits back on, and we're going to move this particle cloud quite a bit into the distance. Make sure that it's still in the camera's viewport, and it is not. Let's move this over here. There it is. So kind of want it to look like it's originating from underneath the container down here. And then I want to adjust the dimension on that so that it just fills kind of this bottom portion of it. Maybe that's actually a little too big, and we can move it up a little. Move. There we go. So what we can do now is we want to create one more replicator. So particles and replicator. And we're going to set here, the point source is going to be all the way down at the bottom here. Come on. Is that particle cloud. And then now the prototype, what we want to do is we want to have it randomly grab any one of these fruits. So what we need to do first is create a group like we've done before. So I'm going to go into my all fruits and I'm going to select the base fruit. Just hit escape a couple times to make sure nothing else is selected. And I'm going to select one of each of the fruits. And then I'm going to go into my groups palette. And I'm going to create a new groups. And I'm going to call this background fruits. Boy. BGFRUITS. Alright, so 5 items are within that group. So that does what we need. So go back to our items list. Select that replicator. And we want now all background fruits is going to be. So you see now it's randomly positioned or randomly grabbed one of the fruits and positioned it at each one of the points within that point cloud. But you'll also notice that even the ones in the background are kind of large, and it's because they're scaling them to 100% even though we've scaled them down in the scene. So we want to go in here and use the prototype transform to scale those down just to make sure that it's using that scale of those. And let's also add some more variation into these guys. So I think on the rotation we're going to say 360, but I'm only going to give it 10 on the X and the Y. I kind of want them to be mostly still upright. And we can change the seed on those. Look back at the camera. And we can transform this particle cloud to sort of get the best position that we want. So kind of rotate those around until we get a position that we're happy with. So I really wanted to concentrate it more down here at the bottom of the image. Just so it gets a little bit busy down there. So let's open up a quick preview and see what that looks like. Of course, with lots and lots of geometry now, preview is going to take a little bit longer to get going. And our scene's going to look a little bit flat because we've disabled our lights. But I'm still happy with the lighting that we did just for our original package, so I'm just retaining that for right now. I don't think I actually mentioned earlier that I did throw in a rear rim light after the fact to bring out some of those details. So some of this background stuff is being brought on by that rim light. Just to note. And I kind of like how the light is shining bright on the close-up elements that we've positioned in here, but the faraway ones aren't quite getting the same light, so they're being pushed back a little bit into the darkness. And I think I would like to emphasize that even a little bit more. We're going to add a little bit of fog to this scene. So that is done in the shader tree, and that's by selecting the shader. So if we kind of minimize some of these things and go down here to the bottom, control fog is enabled, but there's no fog specified. So if we turn this to linear, you'll see we're going to get fog turning in on our scene. And keeping it at the fog color, the default color, kind of gets you an idea of where it's being applied. So we can see. So I think I want to start this off in maybe 5 meters. No, that's still not enough. Maybe we'll do 10 meters for that. And then for the distant one, we're going to do 80 meters. kind of really want to fade those things off in the distance. Yeah, see, so these are getting a little bit of that fog. But I want to use the environment color, so that's going to take this green color from the background and just end up darkening those. So we have a lot of geometry in our scene now that is making this up. Let's save this again. All right, and I think we can add one more sort of little bit of detail here to make this just a little bit more realistic for this scene. And I think I'm going to do that. So select the camera. We're going to add some depth of field in here. Just a tiny little bit to blur out these background elements just so they don't have as much detail and they're not going to draw your eyes. We really want to focus it on this Fruit Bites logo as being sort of the brightest area and the most in focus. So we'll do that selecting the camera and then going into the camera effects subtab. And then we want to take this depth of field option and just enable that. So I'm going to set my f-stop to f1 on that to give us a little bit of depth of field. It's not going to be extreme. And then you can set the focus position actually in preview. So by holding your mouse over a certain position in preview and then hitting Control F, it'll focus right where whatever the mouse pointer is intersecting. So you can see now that I did that over the logo is going to be nice and sharp. So that adjusted this focus distance setting right here to the first element that it intersected with. And you'll see that most of the package will be in focus. It'll get a little bit out of focus at the bottom of it. And then the fruits, as they get further away, this is the benefit of actually not forcing the perspective on that, but moving the fruits around, that those are going to get blurry. Of course, keep in mind also this is going to take more time and more samples to really smooth that out here in the preview. And to get that smooth in the render, you're going to want to set the render and you want to go under the settings and you want to increase your anti-aliasing. For something like this, probably the maximum 1024 samples will be necessary to get a nice smooth depth of field. So we're going to render this guy out and layer this up in Photoshop with the text for the final presentation image. And in the next video, we're going to wrap everything up.